Welcome back to episode 11 of Double Standards and India, Evidence Files. Today we rigorously examine the counterarguments to the pervasive double standards thesis, evaluating whether international trade criticism is fundamentally fair or structurally flawed. In our first two episodes, we laid out the foundational data on global supply chain shocks and diplomatic friction points, setting the stage for a deeper dive into the legal nuances of modern sanctions enforcement. On February 24, 2022, the Russian Federation launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, immediately triggering an unprecedented wave of comprehensive Western economic sanctions designed to isolate Moscow from international financial markets. As global crude oil prices surged past $115 per barrel by March and April 2022, net importing nations faced severe macroeconomic distress, forcing immediate strategic recalibrations in procurement strategies. India dramatically increased its importation of heavily discounted Russian Urals crude, transforming supply chains as its import share rose from under 2% pre-war to over 40% by mid-2023. Western media outlets and European officials frequently claimed that this surge constituted a direct violation of international solidarity, undermining the collective economic coalition supporting Ukraine during the ongoing conflict. However, a rigorous examination of official legal frameworks reveals that no direct Western sanctions were ever placed on the outright purchase of Russian crude oil by third-party sovereign nations. On December 5, 2022, the G7, the European Union, and Australia jointly implemented the Russian oil price cap policy, establishing a hard limit of $60 per barrel. The stated objective of this price cap mechanism was twofold: to keep vital Russian oil flowing to global markets to prevent catastrophic price spikes while severely restricting Moscow's fiscal revenues. Indian purchases fully complied with G7 price cap mechanics when utilizing Western maritime services, and non-Western shipping fleets and insurance options were legally deployed outside of Western jurisdiction. High-ranking Western officials, including US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, explicitly acknowledged that India purchasing discounted oil was entirely consistent with the broader goal of preventing global energy price shocks. At strategic refining hubs like Jamnagar on India's western coast, heavy sour Russian crude was processed into high-value refined petroleum products for both domestic consumption and export markets. Investigative reports by organizations such as the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air highlighted that these refined products subsequently found legal entry into European and American markets. Throughout 2023 and 2024, bilateral trade data revealed that Western economies themselves maintained critical indirect trade channels with Russia, illustrating complex economic interdependencies across multiple sectors. For instance, the United States continued to import enriched uranium from Rosatom for its civilian nuclear power plants well into 2024, issuing statutory waivers to protect domestic energy grids. Similarly, the European Union exempted Russian fertilizers, agricultural products, and critical raw materials such as nickel, titanium, and palladium from comprehensive embargoes to safeguard domestic manufacturing. Comprehensive trade analysis indicates that while direct EU-Russia trade plummeted, trade between the EU and Central Asian intermediaries like Kazakhstan and Armenia saw anomalous multi-100% spikes. Multipolar geopolitical analysts and Indian Ministry of External Affairs officials pointed to these exemptions as evidence of a structural double standard in how sanctions enforcement was publicly moralized. However, defenders of Western policy argue that sanction design intentionally includes vital carve-outs for global public goods to prevent catastrophic humanitarian blowbacks in vulnerable developing economies. Distinguishing targeted economic warfare from total embargoes allowed Western policymakers to maintain global food security through fertilizer exemptions while restricting direct military funding to Moscow. Furthermore, Western nations demonstrated a genuine policy of macroeconomic decoupling, with German natural gas import dependencies dropping precipitously from over 50% to near zero within months. International political economy scholars recognize that modern sanctions regimes inevitably involve strategic carve-outs driven by domestic economic vulnerabilities and asymmetric global interdependencies. In May 2022, Indian External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar forcefully articulated this perspective at a joint press conference in Berlin, emphasizing the divergence of Asian and European security priorities. Minister Jaishankar stated explicitly that Europe has to grow out of the mindset that Europe's problems are the world's problems, while the world's problems are not Europe's problems. India imports approximately 85% of its total crude oil requirements, leaving its domestic economy exceptionally vulnerable to volatile global energy price fluctuations. With a per capita gross domestic product significantly lower than G7 economies, absorbing unmitigated global energy price shocks risked pushing tens of millions of citizens back into poverty. Diplomatic historians observe that India's resolute stance represents a continuation of its historic doctrine of strategic autonomy and non-alignment, successfully adapted to a multipolar 21st-century economic reality. Historical precedents demonstrate that Western nations have routinely prioritized their own domestic economic stability and geopolitical self-interest during regional conflicts in Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America. Critics maintain that short-term economic gains from discounted oil contribute capital directly to the Russian state budget, indirectly facilitating ongoing military operations in Ukraine. Conversely, strategic analysts argue that long-term international security architectures depend on multilateral rule of law, and that ignoring economic realities sets a dangerous precedent for global stability. Throughout fiscal years 2022 to 2023, independent economic analyses confirmed that purchasing discounted Russian crude preserved billions of dollars in foreign exchange reserves for the Indian Treasury. Baltic export terminals like Primorsk and US Teluga, alongside Black Sea ports such as Novorossiysk, became the primary origin nodes for maritime tanker fleets heading toward South Asian refineries. UN Comtrade bilateral trade statistics between 2022 and 2024 verified unprecedented shifts in commodity flows, demonstrating that global trade adapted rapidly to new geopolitical boundaries. The ethical boundary between legitimate structural exemptions and hypocritical double standards in Western sanctions enforcement remains one of the most fiercely debated topics in international political economy. Analysts stress that whether Indian refining of Russian crude constitutes sanctions evading laundering or legal market stabilizing arbitrage depends entirely on one's regulatory perspective. In non-Western capitals, moral pressure from Western democracies frequently holds secondary weight compared to tangible economic security imperatives and the immediate survival needs of massive populations. European Commission consolidated regulations issued between 2022 and 2024 detail extensive sectoral bans accompanied by specific exemptions for energy security and landlocked member state pipelines. US Treasury guidance on the implementation of the price cap policy provided precise compliance attestation rules for maritime service providers operating across international waters. Brookings Institution and Carnegie Endowment policy papers emphasize that managing multipolar friction requires acknowledging legitimate national interests rather than demanding universal moral conformity. As of 2024 and 2025, intelligence and security partnerships like the Quad continue to deepen robustly even as economic disagreements regarding Russian energy procurement persist. Financial Times and Bloomberg investigative reports documented how global crude flows continuously adapt to regulatory adjustments, proving that capital finds legal paths despite sweeping embargoes. Vadna refinery operations in Gujarat further illustrate how Indian private and public sectors optimized complex supply chains to ensure uninterrupted energy security for domestic consumers. Government of India official positions reiterate that energy procurement is driven strictly by national interest and consumer protection in an increasingly volatile global marketplace. G7 and European Commission officials maintain that compliance with price cap mechanisms remains essential to prevent windfall state revenues while acknowledging necessary trade calibrations. Statistical assessments show that developing net importers absorbed over 80% of global inflationary shocks in 2022, underscoring the vital necessity of diversified crude sourcing. Whether criticisms of India's trade policies are judged as fair or unfair ultimately depends on whether one evaluates global commerce through a universalist moral lens or a pragmatic realist framework. St. Petersburg and Baltic shipping lanes continue to facilitate massive energy volumes, demonstrating the enduring limits of extraterritorial sanctions in a deeply interconnected global economy. Trade data confirms that non-Western insurance syndicates and independent tanker registries successfully expanded their market share to service over 60% of sanctioned oil shipments. Economic historians emphasize that accusations of hypocrisy are an inherent feature of asymmetric global interdependence rather than unique diplomatic failures of contemporary administration. New Delhi's proactive diplomatic engagements across Europe, Asia, and the Americas underscore a consistent commitment to maintaining open dialogue while protecting sovereign economic interests. Official statements from the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas verify that diversified crude sourcing directly contributed to stabilizing domestic retail fuel prices across India. As geopolitical friction points continue to evolve, the balance between collective security sanctions and national economic survival will remain a defining theme of 21st-century statecraft. Looking ahead, upcoming trade agreements and maritime policy adjustments will test whether international regulatory frameworks can adapt to an increasingly multipolar global economy. In our final episode of this series, we will synthesize these findings to evaluate the ultimate trajectory of India's rise in global trade, defense partnerships, and technological ambition. As Minister Jaishankar aptly noted, a country as massive and populous as India must make choices that protect its people, anchoring its foreign policy in principled strategic independence. Thank you for joining us for episode 11 of Double Standards and India, Evidence Files, where evidence, trade data, and strategic analysis illuminate the complex realities of modern global geopolitics.